Hey everybody, it's Mrs. Gifford. I just wanted to go over a few things regarding the review for Monday's quiz. First of all, my apologies. I wish I had set up the ones with the grid and the tables so you could draw on them like we did in class. So my apologies for that. And then I also forgot to include a slide with the formula that talks about slope. So I thought I would just take a few moments and go over just a couple of things about slope for you to use as a reminder. First of all, I'm just going to write the word slope here. When we first talked about finding slope, we did it on a graph. Excuse my dog. We did it on a graph first. And so I'm just going to sketch a little X and Y axis here, just super rough, to make sure that I demonstrate what things I am talking about here. So when we talk about slope, I'm going to draw a red line on here. All right, so there's my red line. And one of the things that we talked about on this is finding lattice points. So I'm just gonna, now the lattice points are where like those grid lines cross, and for the most part in our lessons and activities, we've been giving you those lattice points. So just imagine that this was done on a coordinate grid. And these red dots right here are the lattice points. Then I want you to remember that we talked about the fact that we're going to create a triangle and kind of use what we learned back in the Pythagorean theorem unit with drawing that triangle between those 2 points. The other thing that we've been talking about is trying to focus on going from left to right. The first thing that I notice when I have this line is I notice that this line goes down to the right. So if I'm a skier on top of this hill, this is a downhill slope. Because it's downhill, that slope would be negative. So the next thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to do my up and down movements first. In this case, because our line is going down, my rise, remember this is where we have our rise, my rise is actually going to be a negative number because I went down. If we had gone up, my rise would be positive. So let me just type NEG as the abbreviation for negative. Then from that corner, remember, then that we go straight across. And here's our right triangle. And I go to the right. And so in this case, the green is representing our run. And in this case, it's positive because we went to the right. So I'm going to abbreviate positive as POS, negative, NEG. And then I just want to remind you that we talked about slope as being the rise over the run. This talks about the steepness of any line. Okay, the rise over run. For those of you who have been skiing, you know that there's a phrase that says, hey, I'm going to go hit the slopes. Okay, if you think about that, that's talking about going skiing. And so I want you to use that same idea about skiing as when we have a steepness or a slope of a line. Now, that's a positive, or excuse me, this line is a negative, has a negative slope, and that's because it's going down to the right. So I'm just going to write negative here along the line. If you look back at the Desmos, one of the Desmos activities has a graphic with Mr. Slope Guy and the 2 different eyeballs, and the mouth is flat. The nose is undefined, right, because it's that vertical line. So this is slope. We also talk about slope, which we learned the other day. We talk about slope as, actually I'm going to use blue. Switch to black and draw my fraction line. We also talked about slope as being the change in y. Over the change in x. And the other day, we also used, actually in the previous lesson, we talked about the fact that we can also find slope using a formula. Before I talk about that formula, after we did slope in or from a graph, we moved right into finding slope from a table. And remember, we've talked about slope as rise over run since we started this. Rise goes with y's. So when we worked on finding slope from a table, you checked to see what happens going from one y value to the next. If it increased, it was a positive number. If it decreased, it was a negative number. This again is where you get your rise from. Then you did the same thing with the x column, and you look to see how the x's are changing. And this turns into your run. Again, if it's increasing, your run is positive. If it's decreasing, your run would have been negative. Now, the last one is actually going to be what we talked about in the last lesson, and that is using the formula when we were given two coordinate pairs. Remember, we had two different coordinate pairs, and I'm going to get it actually set up here with the black and then switch to the blue. We talked about labeling the x coordinates and the y coordinates. The x's, again, go with run, so I'm going to label them x1 and x2. And then my y's go with rise, so I'm going to also label them, but I'm going to use blue instead. And we talk about the fact that we have this coordinate pair. Now, you can go ahead and graph them on the coordinate grid if there's room, but I did want to reinforce with you the idea of you don't have to because you've got this formula. So I know that slope is also going to be the difference, or y2 minus y1, over the difference of the x's, in this case x2 minus x1. As I mentioned, I forgot to add examples of this on the review, and I wanted to put it all here in one place for you. Now, the only other thing that we hadn't talked about is the y-intercept, and I just want to do a quick review of the y-intercept as well. The y-intercept, if you recall, is the start value. It's where x is 0. Start. It's where x is 0. So you're going to look for that coordinate pair of 0, comma, something. And you're also going to look for, I lost my train of thought. Oh, where it crosses the y-axis. Okay, so in all of the examples that we did in class, that's typically where I used the orange ink, and I don't have orange here. But if we were going to find the y-intercept of this graph over here, I will use red. So this point right here is the y-axis, this one where the red line crosses that y-axis right here. Okay, so that is an example of y-intercept. I'm hoping this helps you out with the review. If you have any questions, feel free to send me a message.